If you grew up in a small town like me, you might also be familiar with the experience of walking to get to where you're going while seemingly everyone else drives. And it's not because cars are better, but because the streets, the whole city really, is broken. Since post-World War II, cars have become the primary mode of transportation in America, and here's what's happened since.
It's the Roaring 20s. Henry Ford ignites the auto industry. By 1920, a new car rolls off the line every 2 hours. Cars are becoming so popular that even young Bill has one.
Traffic in U.S. cities is a large issue.
Hoping to put the brakes on climate change.
The invention and popularization of the automobile propelled the development of our cities into idyllic suburban landscapes. Yet the irony of this picturesque dream that we've been sold in America is that it's actually doing us more bad than good. In fact, suburbs are often associated with an illicit poverty, diabetes, irresponsible driving, low economic rates of prosperity, low social connectivity, and many more residual effects of these conditions that relate not only to the health of our planet, but also to our individual physical and mental health. Think about it. If you live or have lived in the suburbs, how far is the nearest grocery store? Can you get your dry cleaning done around the corner? How often does the bus come? Do you even really feel like making the trip? Often, for me at least, the answer is no. The fundamental design of a suburban landscape forces us to have a car. Now, this isn't to say that suburbs are the only typology of city planning that is bad, but rather to articulate that there are many underlying issues involved in our built environments that can lead it to disrepair. In many parts of Canada and the United States, there are massive issues with urban sprawl around the cities, as well as urban blight within the city. However, the culprit that began it all is our collective overdependence on vehicles. There's a pretty important concept in urban design and city planning called walkability, and it was first coined by this lady named Jane Jacobs. I was first introduced to this concept in university when I was studying design, and I'm going to try and break it down for you because I think it's important. In simple terms, walkability means designing streets for people, but there's a bunch of quantitative and qualitative measures that play into this and contribute to how friendly an area is to walking. You may have seen something called the walk score of a community, which refers to how accessible shops and services are around your house. But the other rates of walkability also include mortality rates, the economic rates of prosperity or decline, and of course, the rate of traffic or congestion. Unfortunately, this philosophy in urban planning didn't come about until the 1960s, 40-something years after the popularization of the car. Now, that might sound like a lot of jargon, but what you really need to understand is that walkability is important because how we move defines how we live. What this means in regards to fixing our cities and slowing climate change is that we need to make a drastic reorientation of mobility towards walking, biking, and transit. A household moving from a drivable suburban neighborhood to a walkable urban place can drop its energy usage and greenhouse gas emissions by between 50 and 80%. The benefits of walkability also pertain to the economy, health, equity, and the community. If streets are designed with accessibility as a standard and the sidewalk or community works well for people in wheelchairs, it in turn works well for everyone. There have been countless studies across demographics and regions that really indicate a strong preference towards the walkable neighborhood, yet we're still not really there in many places, and I think it's in large part because not enough people know how to get there. Fostering walkability must include designers, architects, urban planners, engineers, city council, the government's cooperation, as well as the cooperation of the given community, and you and I. So let's just say we're all doing our part and we are collectively working towards this goal of a walkable neighborhood. What does this then look like? Often it looks like mixed-use communities in which both commercial and residential exist, and creating a sustainable economic framework between households and vendors, and collectively making pragmatic decisions around generating walkability. Something to keep in mind is that people don't really walk unless there's a reason to. So forging neighborhoods that sustain both work and live in adjacency to one another gives people the reason to walk, whether it's to work or to the gym down the street or the restaurant around the corner. By marrying commercial and residential buildings, these businesses can thrive both during the day when people are at work and at night when people go home. Needless to say, we must also keep neighborhood blocks small because wherever connections are snipped or out of reach, places become less vital and less vibrant. Providing the reason to walk can also look like testing car closure models in order to make way for pedestrian activity. The keyword here being testing, because in order to make pragmatic decisions around its sustainability in the given area, we must ensure it thrives before making it permanent. And there's already a bunch of major cities that have done this, including Paris, Brussels, and even Toronto, which have implemented car-free days in which vehicles empty the streets and pedestrians roam the city on foot or on bike. And it's always a very well-received occasion. There's free events, community vendors, and generally a very lively atmosphere that's present. In addition to these economic factors, our bylaws and zoning also play a large part in reshaping our cities and reclaiming land from cars. To start, the government has a responsibility to revoke parking minimums and reform how our neighborhoods are zoned in order to reduce parking, enact more housing, and introduce more mixed-use development. As of 2023, there are between 1 billion and 2 billion parking spots in the United States. Yes, just the United States alone. And trust me, the discrepancy between 1 and 2 billion is not lost on me, but it's honestly the best figure I can give you because the actual number has gotten so large that it is incalculable on a national scale, let alone a global scale. I want you to take a look at these city grids in correlation to their planning, parking, and walkability. Here we have Toronto, which is the most walkable city in Ontario, followed by Vancouver, which ranks highest on a national scale. And not surprisingly, Vancouver, as the most walkable city in Canada, also ranks highest in quality of life. This is New York and San Francisco, who are neck and neck for the title of most walkable city in North America. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Detroit, Los Angeles, which is notoriously touted as an unwalkable city, Dallas, Texas, which is quickly headed in the same trajectory as LA, and Arlington, Texas, which has earned itself the highest possible parking score with a whopping 42% of its central city dedicated to parking. And I think the contrast between their respective city grids begins to explain quite clearly why this is. In LA, for example, there are massive issues with the urban design scheme, including unintuitive and irregular geometry of the streets, which disturbs efficiency, sightlines, and mobility, rendering a very poor and limited transit system, massive urban sprawl with no discernible city center, and unbearably slow traffic as a result. It's also worth mentioning that it's no coincidence that LA, as an unwalkable city, also contains one of North America's largest and most notorious homeless communities known as Skid Row. Unfortunately, these issues are the norm for cities like LA, and between Detroit, Dallas, and Arlington, Texas, these same issues exist. While on the other hand, New York, Toronto, San Francisco, and Vancouver all seem to follow a much more systematic and orderly approach to city layout. However, this isn't to say that these cities are perfect, but just better, at least in regards to walkability, and I think for obvious reason. Once you understand what walkability looks like in one city, you can understand how it can translate into any city. Let's zoom in a bit more. There's this neighborhood in downtown Toronto called Regent Park, and in its historical context, it was a long isolated and decaying social housing project originally built in the 1940s and 50s. But in the past 10 odd years, there has been a massive neighborhood overhaul and regeneration of social housing without resorting entirely to social cleansing. Of course, there's another slew of concerns around gentrification and resistance in the existing community with revitalization schemes like this, but that's a discussion for another video. If we just focus on the design and planning aspects of this scheme, it's a rather prime example of introducing walkability and reactivating neighborhood prosperity. You can see that it follows a small gridded scheme. There are several parks and mixed-use buildings where the lower levels are allocated for restaurants, businesses, shops, and services. Great connectivity to a main street, which offers bike lanes, bike sharing, efficient public transit, and efforts of implementing meaningful public art situated along these public benches. All of these factors contribute to Regent Park's near-perfect walk score of 98 out of 100, paired with a transit score of 94 and a bike score of 99. But of course, design and urban planning in particular is much more nuanced than that, and I'm not suggesting that this is a one-size-fits-all condition for every neighborhood. But the principles at play are all very applicable at different quantities, scales, and times. The environment we create for inhabitants of a given space should be reflective of their lives, culture, and values. It's the reason why Dan Bergeron's Faces of Regent Park is so compelling, not only as a public art installation, but as a community activator. In a way, these paintings have become synonymous to the neighborhood itself. The 12 large-scale portraits showcases Regent Park's residents, and the series is meant to represent the area's diversity. Each of these faces have a story to tell, and I think contribute really meaningfully and beautifully to the social fabric of this neighborhood. To wrap up this video, I want to acknowledge the very real challenges of implementing walkability. As I briefly mentioned earlier, there are concerns around gentrification, resistance in the existing community, as well as restrictions of zoning and bylaws, which include minimums for streets and parking. There's also the convincing that needs to be done for drivers in regards to the trade-off of speed for safety and efficiency with the integration of transit, bike lanes, and pedestrian right-of-way. So how do we do our part and contribute with all these larger forces at play? On an individual basis, it starts with a shift in mindset to walking, but also making the shift as community members to human-centric design and priorities. Supporting public transit systems, bike lanes and bike sharing, personal reduction of driving, as well as ride shares such as Uber. And if you happen to be a designer or a world builder, it means designing for the community as a whole, as opposed to the building as a standalone. And lastly, if you want to learn more, because this is such an extensive topic and I feel like I've really only skimmed the surface, I highly recommend the book Walkable City Rules: 101 Steps to Creating Better Places. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again. Oh my god. Is it done?